John Wayne spent most of his life teaching America how to see him. The hat, the slow walk, the deep voice, the straight stare, the man who never seemed afraid of anybody. To millions of people, John Wayne wasn't simply an actor. He was the cowboy, the soldier, the rancher, the man who could walk into a room and somehow make everybody else look smaller. But the image on the screen was only part of the story, because behind the legend was a man who remembered people. People from before the fame, people who stood beside him when he was still struggling, people who helped turn an unknown young actor into the Duke, and people who were still there in his memories decades after the cameras had stopped rolling. By the time John Wayne reached the final chapter of his life, he had lived through almost everything Hollywood could offer. He had known enormous success. He had known failure. He had lost friends. He had buried people he loved. He had watched entire generations of actors come and go, and yet, when you look closely at his life, certain names keep appearing. Not because they were all famous, not because they were all powerful, but because each of them represented a different part of the man behind John Wayne. One helped discover him. One became his closest friend. One became one of the most important women in his life. One understood the private man behind the public image. And one remained connected to him in a way that had nothing to do with Hollywood. These are 5 people whose presence can be traced through John Wayne's life long after their paths first crossed. And the first name takes us back to a time when John Wayne wasn't John Wayne at all. He was still Marion Morrison, and almost nobody in Hollywood knew his name. Number 5, the man who knew the Duke before there was a Duke. Before John Wayne became a movie star, he was a young man trying to find a way into Hollywood. He had been born Marion Robert Morrison in Winterset, Iowa in 1907, and his family eventually moved to California. He attended the University of Southern California, where football became one of the doors that brought him closer to the movie business. But the young man who would eventually become one of the biggest stars in the world was not walking around Hollywood with a guaranteed future. He was working. He was doing small jobs. He was around movie sets. He was trying to get noticed. And somewhere in those early years, he met a man who would become one of the most important people in his life. His name was Ward Bond. Bond was not a glamorous leading man. He wasn't the face on the poster. He wasn't the person audiences came to see. He was a character actor, big, gruff, funny, sometimes intimidating, and, according to the stories surrounding their early friendship, not exactly the easiest young man to manage. Wayne and Bond had been football teammates at USC, and their relationship eventually moved from college football into Hollywood. Their first important connection came through director John Ford, who hired both men for the 1929 film Salute! And the story of how Wayne remembered those early days tells you almost everything about the friendship that followed. In his unfinished autobiography, Wayne recalled Bond arriving late while the cast and crew were preparing to leave. He described him as being $1 short, with a torn pocket and a gin bottle hanging from the other. Wayne wasn't immediately impressed. In fact, he apparently thought Bond looked like trouble, and he was probably right. But something happened. The 2 men were thrown together. They worked together. They drank together. They got into adventures together. And somewhere between all the arguments, jokes, and long nights, the 2 became brothers in everything but blood. Wayne later described the friendship as one that lasted until the day Bond died. And that is what makes Ward Bond so important to this story. Because Bond didn't meet John Wayne after he became famous. He met him before the world knew who John Wayne was. Before Stagecoach before Red River before The Searchers before True Grit before the Academy Award, before the ranches and the yachts and the enormous Hollywood legend. Bond knew Marion Morrison. He knew the young actor who was still trying to find his place, and perhaps that is why their friendship survived the transformation. Hollywood changes people. Fame changes people. But Bond had known Wayne before either had anything to prove. The 2 men would go on to appear together in more than 20 films and television productions, creating a professional partnership that lasted for decades. Their collaborations included some of the most important movies of Wayne's career, including The Searchers but their relationship wasn't built around work. That was simply the part the public could see. Behind the scenes, they were constantly joking with one another. They teased each other. They traveled together. They shared adventures. And one of the strangest stories from their friendship involved a hunting trip. At some point, Wayne accidentally shot Bond in the backside with a shotgun. Bond wasn't seriously injured, but he never let Wayne forget it. In fact, the joke survived even after Bond was gone. When Bond died suddenly in 1960 from a heart attack at just 57, he left Wayne a shotgun in his will. It was the same shotgun, a final joke from a friend who apparently intended to get the last word even after death. And that tells you something about the kind of friendship they had. It wasn't polished. It wasn't sentimental. It wasn't the kind of Hollywood friendship that looked perfect in photographs. It was messy, loud, competitive, funny, and real. But for Wayne, the loss was anything but funny. Ward Bond had been there before the legend. He had watched the young Marion Morrison struggle. He had watched John Wayne become John Wayne. And then, suddenly, he was gone. That kind of loss doesn't disappear simply because a man is famous. Sometimes, the people who knew you before you became somebody are the people you miss the most. And for John Wayne, Ward Bond was one of those people. But Bond wasn't the man who gave Wayne his biggest break. That man was next. And unlike Bond, he didn't simply become Wayne's friend. He helped create the Duke the world would eventually know. Number 4. The man who created the Duke. There are directors, and then there are directors who change the course of an actor's life. For John Wayne, that man was John Ford. Ford first encountered Wayne when the young actor was still doing small jobs around Hollywood. Ford saw something in him, not necessarily a finished movie star, not yet, but something. Ford eventually gave Wayne an extra role. Then came a speaking part in Asterisk, Salute Asterisk. Then, crucially, Ford recommended Wayne to director Raoul Walsh for Asterisk, The Big Trail Asterisk. That film gave Wayne his first major leading role. It should have changed everything. Instead, it almost changed nothing. Asterisk, The Big Trail Asterisk failed to make Wayne the star Hollywood expected. His career stalled, and the young actor spent years appearing in low-budget westerns. He was not yet the Duke. He was a young actor trying to survive. But Ford didn't forget him. And Wayne never forgot Ford. Their relationship was complicated. Ford could be demanding. He could be cruel. He could humiliate actors. He could make Wayne angry. But he also believed in him. And eventually, when Ford made Asterisk, Stagecoach Asterisk, in 1939, he gave Wayne the opportunity that finally changed his life. Wayne played Ringo Kid. And suddenly, the young actor, who had spent years drifting through low-budget westerns, became a star. The screen image was born, the walk, the posture, the presence, the quiet confidence. John Wayne had arrived. But what makes the relationship with Ford so fascinating is that Wayne never simply described him as another director. Ford became something closer to family. Wayne called him Coach and Pappy. He made Ford godfather to 2 of his sons, Patrick and Ethan. And Wayne kept a framed, signed portrait of Ford in his home until the end of his life. In a letter in 1961, Wayne described Ford as his best friend and said they had a blood kinship. In his unfinished autobiography, Wayne described the relationship in extraordinarily personal terms. Think about that. The man who helped create John Wayne's public image had become part of the private life of the man underneath it. And the relationship wasn't always easy. Ford could be brutally hard on Wayne, but Wayne understood something. The man who challenged him was also the man who had believed in him when Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. Their friendship stretched beyond movie sets. They sailed together, they traveled, they spent long periods aboard Ford's yacht, they drank, they argued, they laughed. They made movies, and then they made more movies. Ford and Wayne became one of the most famous actor-director partnerships in American cinema, but their relationship was never simply about making westerns. Ford had helped shape the mythology, Wayne had become the face of it, and together they created films that would define an era. Asterisk, Stagecoach. Asterisk, Asterisk, Fort Apache. Asterisk, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon. Asterisk, Rio Grande. Asterisk, The Searchers. And Asterisk, The Quiet Man. Ford had seen something in Wayne long before audiences did. He saw the possibility of a screen presence that couldn't be taught in acting school. Wayne didn't need to dominate every scene. Sometimes he only had to stand there. That became the Duke. But there was something else Ford gave him, a sense of belonging. Hollywood is full of people who disappear when your career slows down. Friends become acquaintances, colleagues move on. People who once called you every day suddenly can't remember your number. Ford wasn't like that. Even when they disagreed, the relationship remained. And that is why Ford belongs near the center of John Wayne's story. He didn't simply help John Wayne get famous. He was there when John Wayne was still trying to become someone. There is an important difference, because when you meet somebody after they become a legend, you can never know exactly what they were like before the legend existed. Ford knew, and Wayne knew that Ford knew. Perhaps that is why the relationship survived all the years, arguments and changes that followed. But there was another person who understood Wayne in a completely different way. Someone who could stand beside him on screen and somehow make the world's most famous cowboy look vulnerable. Someone whose chemistry with Wayne became so convincing that audiences began to wonder whether what they were seeing was real. Her name was Maureen O'Hara, and her place in Wayne's life was unlike almost anyone else's. Number 3. The woman who could match the Duke. John Wayne worked with many leading ladies. Some were beautiful, some were talented, some were enormously famous, but very few could stand next to him and make the audience forget they were watching John Wayne. Maureen O'Hara could. When Wayne and O'Hara first appeared together in Rio Grande in 1950, something clicked. The chemistry was immediate, but it wasn't soft, it wasn't passive. O'Hara's characters could fight Wayne, challenge him, argue with him, stand up to him, and that made the relationship fascinating. Wayne was used to playing the strongest man in the room. O'Hara didn't always let him. Their next major collaboration, The Quiet Man *, made their chemistry legendary. Wayne played Sean Thornton, an American who returns to Ireland. O'Hara played Mary-Kate Danaher. The film was funny, romantic, loud, beautiful, and completely different from the tough Western image Wayne had become famous for. For once, the Duke wasn't simply the man with the gun. He was a man falling in love. And Maureen O'Hara gave him someone who could match him. The two would work together again in The Wings of Eagles *, McLintock, and Big Jake *, making 5 films together over more than 2 decades. Their on-screen relationship became so convincing that audiences sometimes assumed there had been a real romance. There wasn't. O'Hara herself was clear about that. Years later, she said they were never sweethearts. But that doesn't make their friendship less meaningful. In some ways, it makes it more interesting, because they didn't need to be romantically involved to understand each other. They recognized something in one another. O'Hara was strong-willed. Wayne was strong-willed. Neither liked being pushed around, and neither was particularly interested in pretending otherwise. O'Hara once described Wayne as a friend she adored, while making clear that their relationship was never romantic. Wayne reportedly had an extraordinary amount of respect for her. He even referred to her as the greatest guy he had ever met. That strange compliment actually says a lot about how he viewed her. He wasn't talking about beauty. He wasn't talking about Hollywood glamour. He was talking about toughness, loyalty, character. O'Hara could take it, and she could give it back. That is exactly why their scenes worked. When they argued on screen, you believed them. When they joked, you believed them. When they looked at each other, you believed there was history between them. And that chemistry became one of the defining features of Wayne's career. But the relationship mattered beyond the screen. O'Hara remained connected to Wayne long after their most famous movies had been made. They reunited for *McLintock* in 1963 and *Big Jake* in 1971. And even as both of their careers changed, their friendship remained. That is important, because by then, John Wayne had become an institution. He wasn't simply an actor anymore. He was an American symbol. But O'Hara had known him when he was still simply another actor on a set. She had seen him laugh. She had seen him get angry. She had seen him make mistakes. She had seen the man. And that is why her place in his story is different from the countless women who appeared beside him on screen. She wasn't simply a leading lady. She was one of the people who could see through the costume. The Duke could fool an audience. He couldn't fool Maureen O'Hara. And perhaps that is why their friendship endured. But there was another relationship that reached even deeper, because John Wayne could have friends in Hollywood. He could have directors who believed in him. He could have co-stars who understood him. But there was one kind of relationship fame could never replace: family. And the fourth name in this story takes us away from the movie set entirely, away from the cameras, away from the westerns, and into the part of John Wayne's life that the public could never fully see. Number 2, the people who knew the man, not the legend. The problem with becoming John Wayne is that eventually people stop seeing Marion Morrison. They see the hat, they see the voice, they see the cowboy, they see the myth. But a family doesn't live with a myth. A family lives with a person. The tired person, the stubborn person, the funny person, the father, the husband, the man who comes home after a long day, the man who can be difficult, the man who can be generous, the man who can make mistakes. And the people closest to Wayne had to live with all of those versions. John Wayne was married 3 times and had 7 children. His family life was complicated, sometimes turbulent, and often very different from the simple heroic image audiences saw on screen. But the children who grew up around him knew something millions of fans never could. They knew the voice without the microphone. They knew the man without the hat. They knew what he was like when nobody was watching. And that matters because Wayne's greatest legacy was not simply the movies he left behind. It was the people he left behind. His children continued to talk about him, not simply as John Wayne the actor, but as their father. That distinction is enormous. Imagine being a child and watching your father become one of the most recognizable men in America. Imagine going to school and hearing strangers talk about the man you call Dad. Imagine seeing his face on posters, hearing his voice on television, watching audiences cheer when he walked into a scene, and then coming home and seeing the same man sitting at the dinner table. That was the contradiction of John Wayne's life. The world had the Duke, his family had John. And perhaps that is why, as he reached the end of his life, the people closest to him mattered more than the public image ever could. Because fame can give you millions of admirers, it cannot give you another childhood. It cannot give you another conversation with your father. It cannot give you back a friend who died too young. It cannot erase the memory of someone who knew you before the world did. And that brings us to the final name, the person who represents something completely different from Ford, Bond, and O'Hara. Not the man who discovered him. Not the friend who grew up beside him. Not the woman who shared some of his most memorable performances. But someone who entered his life later, when the legend was already established. Someone who saw him when the cameras were gone. Someone who stayed close during the final chapter. Someone who knew that John Wayne was not invincible. Because by the end, the Duke had finally met the one opponent no movie could let him defeat: time. Number 1. The person who saw John Wayne at the end. John Wayne spent decades playing men who survived everything. He survived shootouts, wars, ambushes, fights, horseback chases, outlaws, bandits, enemies, and sometimes impossible odds. The characters he played could be beaten, but they rarely stayed down. That was the fantasy. That was the myth. John Wayne was supposed to keep going. But in real life, there comes a point when even the strongest man has to confront something he cannot outshoot, outrun, or outfight. Wayne's final years were marked by serious health problems, and suddenly the man who had spent his entire career playing strength had to live with vulnerability. The public saw the famous image, the cowboy, the tough guy, the Duke, but the people close to him saw something else. They saw a man getting older, a man thinking about his life, a man remembering the people who were gone, and a man who had to confront the fact that his story was approaching its final chapter. One of the people who became particularly important during these final years was Pat Stacey. She had worked as his secretary and eventually became his companion. Their relationship was very different from the Hollywood partnerships that had defined his earlier life. There were no movie cameras, no director shouting instructions, no studio executives, no audience, just life. And that is perhaps the most revealing part. Because when a person becomes famous, it is easy to know the public version. The difficult part is knowing the private version, the version that appears when the day is over, when there is no performance left, when the applause disappears. That is when relationships become real. Wayne had spent decades surrounded by people, But by the end, the question wasn't how many people knew John Wayne, it was who actually knew him. And that is the thread connecting all 5 people in this story. Ward Bond knew the young man before fame. John Ford helped shape the actor before he became an icon. Maureen O'Hara knew the man behind the screen persona. His family knew the father behind the legend. And those closest to him in his final years knew the man who remained when the cowboy could no longer hide behind the character. That is why the title of this story isn't really about 5 famous names. It's about memory. Because John Wayne's life can be measured in movies, hundreds of appearances, decades of work, some of the most recognizable westerns ever made. But a human life isn't measured only by the number of films somebody makes. It is measured by who was there, who stayed, who challenged you, who made you laugh, who believed in you before anyone else did, and who remained in your thoughts when almost everyone else had disappeared. John Wayne died in 1979 at the age of 72. By then, he had become almost impossible to separate from the character he had spent decades creating. The hat was famous, the voice was famous, the name was famous, but the man was still Marion Morrison, the boy from Iowa, the young football player in California, the struggling actor, the friend, the father, the husband, the man who lost people, the man who remembered. And that may be the most interesting thing about John Wayne. For someone who spent his entire career playing men who seemed larger than life, the deepest parts of his story were remarkably human. He loved people, he argued with people, he lost people, he forgave people, and he carried their memories with him. Ward Bond's friendship lasted for more than 3 decades, until Bond's sudden death. John Ford remained one of the most influential relationships of Wayne's entire career, the man Wayne called his best friend and someone with whom he felt a blood kinship. Maureen O'Hara remained a treasured friend and one of the people who could match Wayne's personality both on screen and off. Their 5 films together became part of the mythology of classic Hollywood. And his family carried the private memories of a man the rest of the world could only know through a screen. That is the strange thing about legends. Millions of people remember them. But the people they loved remember something completely different. They remember the voice when it wasn't being projected, the laugh between takes, the arguments nobody filmed, the private jokes, the mistakes, the ordinary mornings, the quiet nights, the moments that never made it into a movie. And perhaps that is why certain people remain unforgettable. Not because they were the most famous, but because they knew you before the world decided who you were. John Wayne spent his life becoming the Duke, but the people closest to him remembered the man. And when the cameras finally stopped, the movies finally ended, and the legend became history, those were the memories that mattered. Because in the end, John Wayne's greatest legacy wasn't a hat, it wasn't a gun, it wasn't a western, it wasn't even the name John Wayne. It was the people who could still tell you who he was when the hat came off. And maybe that's why, after everything he achieved, after everything he lost, and after decades of being remembered by millions, the 5 people who mattered most weren't simply names from his past. They were pieces of the man himself. One represented friendship, one represented loyalty, one represented the career that made him a legend, one represented love and family, and one represented the private life that existed after the applause. The world remembered John Wayne as the Duke. But the people who knew him remembered John, and sometimes that is the difference between being famous and being remembered. So when you watch John Wayne right across the screen again, don't just look at the hat, look at the man wearing it. Because behind every legend is a life, and behind every life are the people who made it matter. Asterisk, asterisk. Which person do you think had the greatest influence on John Wayne's life? John Ford, Ward Bond, Maureen O'Hara, his family, or someone else? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories about the private lives, friendships, heartbreaks, and forgotten moments behind Hollywood's greatest legends, stay with us. Because sometimes the most fascinating story isn't the one Hollywood showed us, it's the one they left out.